1955 novel by Vladimir Nabokov, tells the story of Humbert Humbert, a middle-aged professor who becomes sexually obsessed with 12-year-old Dolores Haze, whom he calls Lolita and Nymphet. The book, known for its sophisticated writing and controversial themes of child abuse, was first published in Paris before being translated into Russian and published in the United States by the author. Despite its mixed reviews, Lolita is considered a literary masterpiece, has been honored by many critics and prestigious organizations, and has been adapted into a film. Plot and main characters. Humbert Humbert, the main character and narrator, a French literature professor living in the United States. He becomes infatuated with Dolores Haze, a 12-year-old girl, after marrying her mother to have an excuse to be near her stepdaughter. Dolores Haze, Lolita, a 12-year-old girl who is the object of Humbert Humbert's obsession. She is nicknamed Lolita and Nymphet by Humbert. Plot: Humbert Humbert obsesses over and sexually abuses Dolores, abducting her and taking her across America while trying to hide his actions. Style and themes. Language. The novel, written in English, is known for its sophisticated, scholarly writing style, masterfully using language to portray complex psychology and dark emotions. Controversy. Lolita is a controversial work due to its themes of child abuse and sexual abuse. It explores the darker aspects of human psychology, non-consensual sex, and is considered a challenge to social moral standards. Publication history and reception. Publication. The book was first published in Paris, France in 1955 and was later translated into Russian by Nabokov and published in New York in 1967. Honors. Despite controversy, Lolita has received widespread critical acclaim. The book has appeared on many classic book lists, such as Time's 100 Best Novels and Le Mans 100 Books of the Century. Adaptations. Lolita has been adapted into film twice, in 1962 by Stanley Kubrick, in 1997 by Adrian Lyne. Part 1. Chapter 1. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my heart, my fault, my soul. Lolita. The tip of the tongue makes 3 passes down the palate to tap, at step 3, on the teeth. She is Lolita, plain, in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 inches tall, wearing 1 stocking. She is Lola in trousers. She is Dolly at school. She is Dolores on the name line. But in my arms, she is always Lolita. Did she have a precursor? She did. Indeed, she did. In fact, there might have been no Lolita at all if I had not loved one summer some primitive girl in a principality by the sea. Oh, when? Approximately as many years before Lolita was born as I was that summer. You can always look to the murderer for the flourishes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, exhibit number 1 is what the superior angels with heavenly wings, the innocent, unknowing angels, envied. Look at this tangled coil of thorns. Chapter 2. I was born in Paris in 1910. My father was a genteel, generous man, a salad of mixed genes, Swiss citizen of mixed French and Austrian descent, with a dash of the Danube running through his veins. I will now distribute some of the beautiful glossy blue postcards. My father owned a luxury hotel on the Riviera. My father and his 2 grandfathers were wine, jewelry, and silk merchants, respectively. At 30, he married an English woman, daughter of the mountaineer Jerome Dunn and granddaughter of 2 Dorset clergymen, experts in obscure subjects, paleopedology and wind harps, respectively. My very photogenic mother died in a freak accident, picnic, lightning, when I was 3. Except for a lingering warmth in some blind alley of the past, nothing of her remains in the shallows and depths of the valley of memory, where, if you can bear my style, I am writing under supervision, the sun of my childhood has set. Surely you all know those fragrant remnants of the day still hovering, with the gnats, around some flowering hedge, or suddenly entered and passed by a wanderer, at the foot of the hill, in the summer twilight. The warmth of the down comforter, the gnats shining yellow. My mother's sister, Aunt Sybil, married my father's cousin, and after being abandoned by him, served in my house as a sort of unpaid governess and housekeeper. I was later told that she had fallen in love with my father and that he had taken advantage of her feelings on a rainy day and had forgotten them as soon as the sky cleared. I was very attached to her in spite of the rigidity, the fatal rigidity, of some of her principles. Perhaps she wanted to make me, on that fateful day, a better widower than my father. Aunt Sybil had deep blue eyes rimmed with pink and a waxen complexion. She wrote poetry. She was poetically superstitious. She said she knew for sure that she would die shortly after my 16th birthday. And so it happened. Her husband, a brilliant perfume salesman, spent most of his time in America, eventually setting up his own company and buying some real estate there. I grew up, a healthy and happy child, in a bright world of comic books, clean sand, orange trees, friendly dogs, ocean views, and smiling faces. The magnificent Marana Hotel revolved around me like a world of its own, a white-painted universe, nestled in the larger, glowing blue universe outside. From the apron-clad dishwasher to the flannel-clad dictator, everyone loved me. Everyone pampered me. Old American ladies leaned on their canes towards me like the leaning towers of Pisa. Bankrupt Russian princesses, unable to pay my father, still bought me expensive candy. He, mon cher petit papa, took me out sailing and cycling, taught me to swim, dive, and surf, read Don Quixote and Les Miserables to me. I adored and respected him. I felt happy for him when I overheard the servants gossiping about his various mistresses, beautiful, gentle creatures who cared for me, cooed and shed precious tears over my happy motherlessness. I went to an English day school a few miles from home, where I played rackets and fives, got excellent grades, and got along very well with my classmates and teachers. The only definite sexual events I remember occurring before my 13th birthday, that is, before I first met my little Annabelle, were a formal, polite, purely theoretical exchange about the surprises of puberty in the school rose garden with an American boy, the son of a famous film actress of the time, whom he seldom saw in 3 dimensions, and some strange reactions on the part of my body to some pictures, pearly and dark, with extremely soft edges, in Pichon's splendid and apparently very expensive copy of La Beauté Humaine, which I had stolen from under a mountain of hard-bound, marbled graphic magazines in the hotel library. Later, in his cheerful, easygoing manner, my father taught me all he thought I needed to know about sex. It was in the autumn of 1923, just before sending me to a lycée in Lyon, where we were to spend 3 winters. But alas, that summer my father went to Italy with Madame de R and her daughter, so that I had no one to complain to, no one to ask after me. Chapter 3. Annabelle, like the writer of these lines, was of mixed blood, but in her case half English, half Dutch. I do not remember her features as clearly now as I did a few years ago, when I did not know Lolita. There are 2 kinds of visual memory. One is when you skillfully recreate an image in the photographic laboratory of your mind, with your eyes open, and then I pictured Annabelle in such general terms as honey complexion, slender arms, brown-cropped hair, long eyelashes, wide, bright mouth. And the other is when you immediately conjure up, with your eyes closed, on the dark inner part of your eyelids, a perfect, objective copy of your beloved face, a little ghost in natural colors, and that is how I saw Lolita. So let me limit myself in describing Annabelle to the remark that she was a lovely girl, a few months younger than myself. Her parents were old friends of Aunt Sybil's, and as old-fashioned as Auntie. They rented a villa not far from the Marana Hotel. Mr. Lee was bald and swarthy, and Mrs. Lee, née Vanessa Van Ness, was fat and powdered. How I hated them. At first, Annabelle and I talked about nothing. She kept scooping up fine sand and letting it run through her fingers. Our thoughts were directed in the same direction as those of the bright European teenagers of our class at that time. I am afraid that there was not much personal genius to be found in our interest in the diversity of inhabited planets, in tennis matches, infinity, solipsism, and so on. The softness and fragility of newborn animals caused us the same sharp pain. Annabelle wanted to be a volunteer nurse in some starving Asian country. I wanted to be a famous spy. Suddenly we fell in love, wildly, clumsily, shamelessly, miserably, hopelessly, I should add, because that mad desire to possess each other could only be assuaged by drinking up and dissolving every drop of each other's soul and body. And yet we could not even mate with each other, as slum children so easily find the opportunity to do. After our daring attempt to meet at night in her garden, of which I will say more later, the only privacy we were allowed,
out of earshot, but not out of sight, in the crowded part of the beach. There, on the soft sand, a few steps from the adults, we would lie all morning, immersed in a numbing thirst for love, and take advantage of every opportunity of space and time to touch each other. Her hand, partly hidden in the sand, crept towards me, her slender brown fingers intoxicatingly coming closer and closer. Then her milky white knee began its long, cautious journey, sometimes a sand dune, accidentally built by some younger children, gave us enough cover to devour each other's dry lips. These half-hearted touches brought our vigorous and inexperienced young bodies to such a state of intense excitement that even the cool, blue water, in which we continued to caress each other, could not soothe. Among the few treasures I lost in the wanderings of my adult life was a photograph taken by my Aunt Sybil in a roadside cafe, showing Annabelle, her parents, and a solemn, lame old gentleman, a Dr. Cooper, who had courted my aunt that summer, sitting around a table. Annabelle was not very clear, for she was taken just as she was bending over her chocolate glacé, her slender bare shoulders and the parting in her hair being all that could be seen, as I remembered the photograph, amid the sun-smeared haze in which her beauty faded. But I, sitting somewhat apart from the rest, stood out dramatically, a sad, caterpillar-browed fellow in a dark sports shirt and well-tailored white shorts, his legs crossed, sitting sideways, looking into the distance. This photograph was taken on the last day of our disastrous summer, just a few minutes before we made our second and final attempt to defy fate. Under the flimsiest of pretexts, it was our last chance and nothing else really mattered. We slipped out of the cafe, went to the beach, found a deserted stretch of sand, and there, in the purple shade of some red rocks forming a sort of small cave, we had a brief conversation of longing caresses, with someone's forgotten sunglasses as the only witness. I knelt down, about to possess my beloved, when two bearded bathers, the old man of the sea and his brother, emerged from the sea, with vulgar cheers, and 4 months later she died of typhus on the island of Corfu. Chapter 4. I turned these miserable memories over and over again, and kept asking myself, had the cracks in my life begun then, in the sparkling light of that distant summer, or had my burning desire for that child only been the first signs of an inherent eccentricity? When I tried to analyze my desires, motives, actions, etc., I indulged in a kind of nostalgia that fed my analytical power with countless options and made every path I imagined branch, and continue to branch endlessly in the maddeningly complex vision of the past. However, I believed that, by some mysterious path of fate, Lolita also came from Annabelle. I also knew that the shock of Annabelle's death had reinforced the disappointment of that nightmare summer, making it a permanent barrier to all subsequent love affairs in my cold youth. Our souls and bodies were so perfectly blended that the insensitive, materialistic, crude, fashionable youths of today cannot possibly understand it. Long after her death, I still felt her thoughts drifting through mine. Long before we met, we had the same dreams. We compared notes. We discovered strange similarities. In the same June, in the same year, 1919, someone else's canary fluttered into her house and mine, in two far-flung countries. Oh, Lolita, if you had loved me like that. I devote the last part of my Annabelle period to describing our first unsuccessful tryst. One night, she had fooled the cruel vigilance of her family. In the restless grove of skinny-leafed mimosa trees behind their villa, we found a perch on the remains of a low stone wall. Through the darkness and the soft branches we could see the arabesques of the lighted window, which now, with the tint of sharp memory, stood out to me like playing cards, perhaps because the enemy was busy playing bridge. She trembled and shrank as I kissed the corner of her parted lips and the hot lobe of her ear. A faint constellation hovered above among the long, slender leaves. The fluttering sky seemed as naked as she under her thin dress. I watched her face against the sky, strangely clear, as if it were radiating its own hazy glow. Her legs, her lovely, living legs, were only half closed, and when my hand moved she found what she was looking for, a dreamy and mysterious expression, half happy, half painful, appeared on that childish face. She sat a little higher than I, and whenever, in her lonely rapture, she wanted to kiss me, her head would bend down with a sleepy, soft, languid, almost pathetic movement, and her bare knees would clasp my wrists, squeeze them, then loosen them. Her mouth, trembling, distorted by the bitterness of some mysterious elixir, drew in a hissing breath, and leaned close to my face. She tried to soothe the pain of love, first by pressing her dry, burning lips to mine. Then my beloved leaned away, tossing her hair nervously, then drew nearer sadly, opening her mouth to be fed, while, with a generosity ready to give her everything, heart, throat, entrails, I gave her to hold my scepter of passion in her clumsy hand. I remember the scent of some kind of bath powder. I believe she stole it from her mother's Spanish maid, a sweet, cheap musk. It mingled with the biscuity scent of her body, and my emotions suddenly surged to full force. A sudden tremor from the bushes nearby stopped them, and as we parted, our veins throbbing, focused on what was almost certainly a cat on the prowl, her mother's voice called to her in a more and more frantic tone from the house, and Dr. Cooper limped heavily into the garden. But that virgin grove, the starless sky, the tickling sensation, the blazing fire, the sweet honey and the stinging pain remained with me, and the girl with the beach legs and the ardent tongue haunted me ever since for 24 years afterward, until I broke her spell by transforming her into another girl. Chapter 5. My youthful days, when I look back, seem to have flown away from me in a whirlwind of vague, recurring fragments, like the morning blizzard of used tissues that passengers see swirling behind the observation car at the end of a train. I was pragmatic, cynical, and quick in my hygienic relations with women. As a student in London and Paris, prostitutes were enough for me. My studies were meticulous and intense, but not particularly fruitful. I had originally planned to take a degree in psychiatry like so many other monk talents, but I was even more monk than they, unusually exhausted. I felt the pressure, the doctor, sick, and I turned to English literature, where so many discouraged poets had degenerated into pipe-smoking teachers in tweed suits. Paris suited me well. I discussed Soviet films with exiles. I sat with homosexuals at Les Deux Magots. I wrote rambling essays for obscure magazines. An article of mine entitled The Proustian Theme in a Letter by Keats to Benjamin Bailey made 6 or 7 scholars smile when they read it. I rolled up my sleeves to write a histoire abrégée de la poésie anglaise for a famous publisher, and then began compiling a textbook on French literature for English-speaking students, with comparisons drawn from English writers. This book occupied me throughout the 40s, and the last volume of it was almost ready for printing when I was arrested. I found work teaching English to a group of adults in Auteuil. Then the boys' school employed me for 2 winters. Occasionally I took advantage of my acquaintance with social workers and psychotherapists to accompany them to various institutions, such as orphanages and reform schools, where pale, adolescent girls with thick, curling eyelashes could be seen, with the complete impunity of being seen, reminiscent of what one is given in dreams. Now I want to introduce the following idea. Between the ages of 9 and 14, young women appear who reveal to certain enchanted travelers, twice or many times their age, their true nature, that of fairies, that is, monsters, and not of men, and I propose to name these darlings nymphets. It is easy to see that I use temporal terms instead of spatial ones. In fact, I want the reader to see 9 and 14 as the boundaries, the mirror beaches and the pink rocks of the enchanted island that my nymphets frequent, surrounded by the vastness of the misty sea. Are all girls within that age limit nymphets? Of course not. Otherwise, we who understand, we lonely travelers, we nymphet-crazed men, would have gone mad long ago. And beauty is not the criterion, and vulgarity, or at least what a given community considers vulgar, does not necessarily impair the mystical qualities, the bewitching charm, the sly, cunning, elusive, heartbreaking allure that separate the nymphet from the blunt girl. The age of Lolita is still more dependent than ever on the space of simultaneous phenomena than on the dreamy oasis of enchanted time where Lolita plays with her kindred spirits. Within this same age range, the number of genuine nymphets is always markedly lower than the number of temporarily ugly, or really cute, pretty, even charming and attractive, ordinary, plump, homely, cold-skinned, human-looking little girls with round bellies and pigtails, who may or may not grow up to become gorgeous women. Look at those ugly pudgy girls in black stockings and white hats who transform into extremely attractive movie stars. Show the average man a photograph of a group of schoolgirls or Girl Scouts and ask him to point out the cutest girl, and he will not necessarily choose the nymphette among them. One must be at once an artist and a madman, a man of immense melancholy, with a hot bubble of poison in his loins and a red flame of passion always burning in his marrow. Oh, how one must try to shrink and hide it, to recognize at once, by signs that are difficult to explain in words, the faintly feline-like curves of the cheekbones, the slender legs and arms covered with downy hair, and many other signs which despair, shame, and tears of weakness prevent me from enumerating. The little devils of death among the good children, she stood among them, unrecognized, and not yet conscious of her own extraordinary power. Moreover, since the idea of time plays such a magical role in this affair, the student should not be surprised to learn that a gap of several years, I believe not less than 10, usually 30 or 40, and as much as 90 in some quite famous cases, is necessary between the maiden and the man, to enable him to fall under the spell of the nymphette. It is a question of focal alignment, of a certain distance sufficient for the inner eye to reach out with joy, of a certain contrast sufficient to awaken the mind panting with the desire for forbidden fruit. When I was a boy and she was a girl, little Annabelle was not a nymphette to me, I was her equal, a faunlet in her own right, on that same enchanted island of time. But today, in September 1952, after 29 years, I think I can see the original demon, my curse, hidden in her. We loved each other with a youthful love, characterized by the intensity that so often destroys adult life. I was a strong boy and survived, but the poison seeped into the wound, which never healed, and I soon found myself growing up in a civilization that allows a 25-year-old man to court a 16-year-old girl, but not a 12-year-old girl. So it is not surprising that my adult years in Europe proved to be so two-faced as to be monstrous. On the surface, I had so-called normal relationships with worldly girls who wore pumpkins or pears for breasts. Inside, I was consumed by the hellish furnace of a peculiar lust for every passing nymphette that a law-abiding coward like me dared not approach. The women I was allowed to use were only temporary palliatives. I was willing to believe that the sensations I got from natural love-making were exactly what the big males felt when they mated with their big mates in the steady, rhythmic thrusts that still shook the world. Unfortunately, those gentlemen did not see, but I had glimpsed, a pleasure infinitely more poignant. My dullest wet dream was 1,000 times brighter than all the adulterous stories the most virile writer of genius or the most skilled impotent could imagine. My world split in two. I perceived not one but two sexes, neither of which was mine, both of which the anatomist would name female. But to me, through the lens of perception, they were as different as trees and clouds. I can explain all this now, but in my 20s and 30s I did not understand my agony so clearly. While my body knew what it craved, my soul rejected all its pleas. At times I felt shame and fear, at other times I was recklessly optimistic. Taboos suffocated me. Psychoanalysts courted me by pretending to release false libidos. The fact that the only objects that could move my heart were Annabelle's sisters, maids, and maids sometimes seemed like a warning sign of madness. At other times I told myself that it was a matter of perspective, that there was really nothing wrong with being excited to the point of frenzy by girls. Let me remind the reader that in England, with the passing of the Children and Young Persons Act in 1933, the term girl was defined as a girl between the ages of 8 and under 14, later, from 14 to 17, the law defined a minor. In the U.S. state of Massachusetts, on the other hand, a rebellious child was, by law, a child between the ages of 7 and 17, moreover, one who was in the habit of associating with vile people. Hugh Broughton, the controversial writer of the reign of James I, demonstrated that Rahab had been a prostitute since she was 10. All this is interesting, and I dare say you see me foaming at the mouth in excitement, but no, I am not, I am just throwing happy thoughts into a small bowl of coins. Here are some more pictures. Here was Virgil, who could sing the praises of a nymphette in a monotone, but perhaps more fascinated by the perineum under the scrotum of a young man. Here were two Nile princesses of marriageable age, daughters of King Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. The royal couple had a litter of 6, clad in nothing but glowing beads, lounging on pillows, untouched after 3,000 years, with their soft brown pup bodies, cropped hair, and long, ebony eyes. Here were some 10-year-old brides, forced to sit on ivory fascinum in the cathedral of classical learning. Prepubescent marriage and cohabitation were not uncommon in many eastern Indian provinces. An 80-year-old Lepcha man had sex with an 8-year-old girl, and no one cared. After all, Dante fell madly in love with his Beatrice when she was 9 years old, a glittering, painted, lovely girl, bejeweled, dressed in a crimson dress, in 1274, in Florence, at a private party in the pleasant month of May. And when Petrarch fell madly in love with his Lorraine, she was a 12-year-old blonde nymphette, running about in the wind, pollen, and dust, a flower in flight, in the beautiful plain seen from the Vaucluse hills. Well, let us be polite and courteous. Humbert Humbert tried his best to be kind. He was sincere. He had the utmost respect for ordinary children, with their innocence and vulnerability, and he would never have touched the child's virginity if there was even the slightest risk of scandal. But how his heart beat faster whenever, in the midst of the innocent crowd, he caught sight of a little devil, enfant charmant et4b, with dim eyes and fresh lips, 10 years in prison if he let her know he was looking at her. So life went. Humbert could have had intercourse with Eve, but it was Lilith he desired. The nascent stage of breast development appeared quite early, 10.7 years, in the series of physical changes that accompany puberty. And the next sign of maturity was the first appearance of pigmented pubic hair, 11.2 years. My little bowl was filled to the brim. Shipwreck. Coral Island. Alone with the shivering child of a drowned passenger. My dear, it was only a game. Oh, how wonderful were my imaginary adventures as I sat on the hard park bench pretending to be lost in a trembling book. Around the quiet scholar's house, nymphets played and played, as if he were a familiar statue or part of the shade and the shimmering sunbeams under the old tree. Once, a very pretty girl in a plaid skirt, clattering her heavily harnessed leg on the chair, right next to me, put her slender bare arms around me, tightened the laces of her roller skates, and I melted in the sun, with only my books as fig leaves, her curly auburn hair falling over her skinned knees, the shadow of the leaves she shared with her mingling with the sunburned calf next to my cheek, constantly changing color. Another time, a red-haired schoolgirl held my arm in the metro, and the auburn I discovered in her armpit lingered in my blood for weeks. I could tell many such unrequited romances. Some of them ended in hell. For instance, the time I suddenly saw from my balcony a lighted window across the street, and what looked like a nymphette undressing before a conspiratorial mirror. Because of its isolation, because of its distance, the vision had a particularly powerful attraction, making me rush at full speed toward my solitary satisfaction. But suddenly, devilishly, those soft nude patterns that had fascinated me transformed into the disgusting, lamplit arm of a man in his underwear reading a newspaper by an open window on a hot, humid, desperate summer night. Jump rope, jump umbrella. The old woman in black sat down next to me, on my bench, on my pleasure bosom. A nymphette was groping for a lost marble just below, and asked if I had a stomachache, the insolent witch. Alas, leave me alone in the park of adolescence, in my moss-covered garden. Let them play around me forever. Never grow up again. Chapter 6. By the way, I often ask myself, I wonder what will happen to those nymphets in the future? In this wrought iron world of karma, will the secret emotions I secretly steal affect their future? I have taken possession of her and she will never know. That's it? But will it have any effect at some point in the future? Will I somehow interfere with her life by drawing her image into my sensuality? Oh, that was, and still is, a source of great and terrible surprise. And yet I knew what they would look like when they grew up, those lovely, maddening, slender-armed nymphets. I remember walking alone in a grey spring afternoon along a bustling street somewhere near the Madeleine. A little girl passed me, nimble and light on her high heels. We glanced at each other at the same time. She stopped and I went to speak to her. She was just as tall as my chest hair and had the round, dimpled face of French girls, and I liked her long eyelashes and her pearly grey dress, tailored to her youthful body, which still retained, and it was an echo of the nymphette, a pleasant chill, a sudden erection in my groin, something childish mingled with the professional fretilement of her nimble little ass. I asked her the price, and she answered quickly with a silvery musical precision, a bird, a real bird. Cent. I tried to bargain, but she saw the wild, lonely desire in my eyes, which were looking down to her round forehead and her crude hat, a ribbon, a bouquet of flowers. Then with a wink, "Tant pies," she said, and pretended to go away. Perhaps 3 years ago I could have seen her coming home from school. That association ended all hesitation. She led me up the familiar steep staircase, with its familiar ringing bell, clearing the way for any monsieur who did not care about meeting another monsieur, on the gloomy climb to the miserable room, which contained nothing but a bed and a wash basin. As usual, she asked for a petit cadeau, and as usual I asked her name, Monique, and age, 18. I was well acquainted with the nonsense of street prostitutes. Each one answered Dick's with a short, decisive, and feigned wistfulness that they, poor little creatures, sing a dozen times a day. But in Monique's case, it was certain that she had added, not subtracted, a year or 2 from her real age. I deduced this from many details of her firm, clean, and strangely youthful body. After stripping off her clothes with such rapidity, she stood for a moment by the window, half wrapped in the dark chiffon curtain, listening with childish delight, as if waiting, to a man playing an organ in the dusty yard below. When I looked at her little hands and directed her attention to her dirty nails, she innocently grimaced and said, "Yes, it's not my fault," 7, and started to go to the sink, but I said it didn't matter at all. With her short brown hair, her bright grey eyes, and her pale complexion, she was perfectly attractive. Her hips were no wider than those of a squatting boy. In fact, I don't hesitate to say, and this is, in fact, why I linger so gratefully in that grey chiffon room of my memory with little Monique, that of the 80 or so girls I've ever spent with myself, she's the only one who's ever given me a real pang of pleasure. Il était malin, celui qui invente ce truc là, she commented politely, and put her clothes back on with the same fashionable speed as she'd taken them off. I asked her for another appointment, more formal, later that same afternoon, and she promised to meet me at 9 o'clock at the cafe on the corner, and swore that she had never posed un lapin in all her young life. We returned to the same room, and I could not help but say how beautiful she was, to which she replied shyly, "You are so beautiful," and then, noticing what I had just noticed in the mirror of our little paradise, the terrible grimace of my teeth-grinding affection, the good little Monique, oh, what a perfect nymphette she was, wanted to know if she had to wipe the red lipstick off her lips, avant tu on se couch, in case I was about to kiss her. Of course, I was going to do it. I gave myself up to her more completely than I had ever done with any young girl before, and my last impression that night of long-lashed Monique was colored by a cheerfulness which I had rarely seen accompany any event in my humiliating, sordid, secret love life. She seemed perfectly satisfied with the 50 francs I had given her, and sauntered out into the April drizzle, accompanied by Humbert Humbert, who was heavily, my feet were numb, following her thin shadow. Stopping in front of a shop window, she exclaimed with great delight, "Je vais émaquiller de basse," and I can never forget the gesture with which her Parisian childish lips formed the word basse, pronouncing it with a desire that made the A sound almost turn into a short, cheerful O that exploded in the word bot. I met her again at my house at 2:15 the following afternoon, but this time it was more boring. She seemed to have grown up overnight, less childish, more womanly. The cold she caught forced me to cancel our fourth date, but I was not sad because I had broken the chain of emotions that threatened to burden me with painful fantasies and fade into dull disappointment. Let her remain the smooth, slender Monique she had been for a few minutes, a misguided nymphette shining through the pragmatic, insensitive young whore. My brief acquaintance with her began a train of thought that is perhaps quite obvious to the discerning reader. An advertisement in a salacious magazine had led me, in the heat of the moment, into the office of a certain MLLE Edith, and she began by offering me to choose my partner from a collection of rather formal photographs in a rather filthy album, regarded as Moisette Belle Brune. When I pushed the album away and somehow managed to express my sinful desire, she looked as if she would turn me out of the door. However, after asking how much it would cost me to pay, she condescended to introduce me to the person who arranged the arrangement. The next day, an asthmatic, make-up smeared, garrulous old woman, reeking of garlic, with a humorous Provençal accent and a black mustache on her purple lips, dragged me to what appeared to be her own house, and there, after kissing the tips of my bunched banana fingers to announce the freshness of my merchandise, she, with a theatrical gesture, drew aside the curtain to reveal what I guessed was part of the room where a large and careless family usually slept. It was empty, except for a fat, sallow, hideous girl of at least 15, with a thick braid of black hair tied with a red ribbon, who sat on a chair pretending to caress a bald doll. When I shook my head and tried to escape the trap, the old woman, chattering away, began to strip the girl's dirty, dingy woolen dress from her bulky body. Then, seeing my determination to leave, she demanded lipstick. The door at the end of the room opened, and two men who were eating dinner in the kitchen jumped into the argument. They were weird, bare-necked, dark, and one of them wore sunglasses. The boy and the dirty, bow-legged toddler hid behind them. With the fishmonger logic of the nightmare, the mad madam pointed at the bespectacled man, shouting that this guy used to be in the police force. "Back off, so I better do as I said." I approached Marie, for that was the fat girl's star name, who quietly dropped her heavy bottom into the chair at the table and continued eating her unfinished soup, while the toddler picked up the doll. With a surge of compassion that dramatized a stupid gesture, I slipped the bill into the fat girl's indifferent hand. He handed my gift over to the ex-detective, and I was soon allowed to slip away. Chapter 7. I don't know whether the madam's album added another knot to the chain of peach blossoms, but soon after, for my own safety, I decided to get married. It occurred to me that regular hours, home-cooked meals, all the tacit agreements of marriage, contraception in the marital bed, and, who knows, the cultivation of some moral values, some spiritual substitutes, might help me, if not to purge myself of base and dangerous desires, at least to keep them under peaceful control. The little money I had inherited after my father's death, it wasn't much, the Marana had long since been sold, combined with my somewhat violent but still striking good looks, allowed me to embark calmly on the hunt. After much deliberation, my choice fell on the daughter of a Polish doctor. The good man was curing me of dizziness and palpitations. We played chess. The doctor's daughter watched me from behind her easel, inserting her eyes or knuckles borrowed from me into the cubist rubbish that well-bred young ladies of that time used to paint instead of lilacs and sheep. Allow me to make my impression by repeating, I was, and still am, despite mes malheurs, a man of extraordinary beauty, slow-moving, tall, with soft dark hair and a touch of sadness that added to his charm. Unusual masculinity is always reflected, on the subject's ostentatious features, by sullen melancholy and a concentration of blood on something related to the why the sea concealed. And that was my situation too. Alas, I knew only too well that I could reap any old maid I could choose with a snap of my fingers. Indeed, I even made it a habit not to show too much interest in women lest they fall, ripe, into my cold lap. If I were a Francais moyen with a taste for flashy ladies, I could easily have found, among the crazy beauties who still winked at my stubborn rock, creatures far more alluring than Valeria. My choice, however, was prompted by calculations which were, as I understood too late, a pitiful compromise. All this shows how terribly stupid poor Humbert had always been in matters of sex. Chapter 8. Although I told myself I was only looking for a pleasant presence, a painted pot au feu, a fresh braid, what really drew me to Valeria was her feigned innocence. She didn't act this way because she knew something about me, it was just her style and I fell for it. In truth, she was at least in her late 30s, I never knew exactly how old she really was, because even her passport was a lie, and had lost her virginity in situations that changed with the moods of her memories. And I, for my part, had been naive in the way only a pervert can be. She had a smooth and cheerful appearance, dressed à la gamine, showing off most of her smooth legs, knowing how to emphasize the white skin of her bare instep with the black of her velvet slippers, and pouting, and giggling, and shaking her skirt, and pursing her mouth to reveal her dimples, and tossing her short blonde curls in the cutest and most boring coquetry imaginable. After the brief ceremony at the mairie, I took her to her new apartment and, somewhat to her surprise, forced her into a simple little girl's nightgown I had managed to swindle from the bathing clothes cupboard of an orphanage. I had a little fun on that wedding night and had caught a fool in a frenzy of joy at dawn. But reality quickly set in. The dyed blonde curls revealed their dark roots, the down turned to bristles on the shaved shins, her moist, flexible mouth, which, despite all the love I had stuffed into it, revealed a humiliating resemblance to the corresponding part of the precious portrait of her dead, toad-faced mother, and now, in place of the pale street girl, Humbert Humbert carried in his arms a large, fat, short-legged, big-breasted, and almost brainless Baba. This relationship lasted from 1935 to 1939. Her only redeeming quality was her taciturnity, which contributed to the strange comfort of our cramped, shabby apartment, 2 rooms, one window overlooking a dim landscape, the other looking onto a brick wall, a tiny kitchen, a shoe-like bathtub, in which I felt like Monsieur Marat, except for the white-collared girl who would stab me in the chest. We spent many a cozy evening together, she absorbed in the Paris soir, while I worked at the rickety table. We went to the cinema, to the cycling races, and to the boxing matches. I seldom paid attention to her putrid flesh, except when absolutely necessary and desperate. The grocer in the house opposite had a little daughter, the sight of whom drove me crazy, but with Valeria's help I somehow found a few legitimate outlets for my oppressive fantasies. As for cooking, we secretly gave up pot au feu and often went to a crowded restaurant on Rue Bonaparte, where the tablecloths were stained with wine and there was a lot of foreign chatter. Next door, the curio dealer displayed in a cluttered cabinet a beautiful, colorful, green, red, yellow, and blue-black antique American estampe locomotive with a huge smokestack, large Baroque lamps, and a huge front bumper, powerfully pulling its dark purple cars through the stormy prairie night and mingling countless jets of black smoke with rough thunderclouds. These stories came to an end. In the summer of 1939, mon oncle d'Amérique died, leaving me an annual income of several $1,000s, on the condition that I come to America and show some interest in his business. This prospect was extremely pleasant to me. I felt that my life needed a jolt. And another reason, several flea-bitten holes had appeared in the velvety comfort of our marriage. In recent weeks I had noticed that my fat Valeria was no longer herself. She became suspiciously insecure, even a little uneasy at times, which was completely out of keeping with the conventional character she believed she had acquired. When I told her that she would soon be joining me on a ship to New York, she seemed nervous and confused. There was some trivial trouble with her papers. She had a Nansen passport, or, to be more precise, nonsense, which, for some reason, the sharing of her husband's genuine Swiss citizenship couldn't have made it any better, and I'm sure the long queues at the prefecture, along with many other formalities, had made her so indifferent, despite my patient descriptions of America, the land of rosy children and giant trees, where life would be much better than in drab, dreary Paris. That morning, as we were leaving some office building, with her paperwork almost in order, Valeria, who was waddling beside me, suddenly began to shake her shaggy head vigorously without saying a word. I let her do this for a while, then asked her if something was on her mind. She replied. I translated her French, which I assumed was also a translation of some Slavic nonsense. There's another man in my life. At the time, that was a harsh word for a husband. They shocked me, I confess. It was impossible to beat her up in the street, right away, as a real brute might do. Years of silent suffering had taught me superhuman self-control. So I took her into the taxi that had been driving slowly and invitingly along the curb, and in that comparative privacy I gently asked her to explain her foolish words. Anger rose up in me, choking me not because I had any particular affection for this clown Madame Humbert, but because the matters of legal and illegal intercourse were mine alone to decide, and yet she, Valeria, this comic wife, was brazenly preparing to arrange my comfort and my fate as she pleased. I asked her to name her lover. I repeated the question, but she continued to babble humorously, recounting her misery because of me and announcing her intention of immediate divorce. Mais qui I finally shouted, hitting her knee with my fist, and she, without even wincing, stared at me as if the answer were too simple to be given in words, then shrugged quickly and pointed to the taxi driver's thick neck. He stopped at a small cafe and introduced himself. I can't remember his ridiculous name, but I can still see him clearly after all these years, a stocky ex-blazer colonel with a bushy mustache and a crew cut. There were thousands of them plying this slovenly trade in Paris. We sat down at the table, the white guard ordered wine, and Valeria, pressing a damp napkin to her knee, began to speak, pouring into me rather than speaking to me. She poured words into this majestic jar with a constant fluency I had never suspected her of. From time to time she would fire off bursts of Slavonic into the direction of her calm lover. The situation was ridiculous, and became even more ridiculous when the colonel, driving the taxi, interrupting Valeria with a possessive smile, began to reveal his ideas and plans. In careful but badly pronounced French, he outlined the world of love and work he planned to enter, hand in hand, with Valeria, his childish wife. She was now preening herself between him and me, pouting, applying lipstick, drooping her chin, adjusting her bosom, and doing other antics, and he spoke of her as if she did not exist, and, moreover, as if she were some kind of special needs child, in the process of being transferred, for the baby's sake, from one experienced guardian to another even more experienced one. Though my impotent anger distorted and exaggerated the impression, I could swear that he had indeed consulted me on such things as her diet, her menstrual cycle, her wardrobe, the books she had read or should read. I think, he said, she will like Jean Christophe. Oh, he was a wise taxi driver, Mr. Taxovish. I silenced his buzz by suggesting that Valeria pack up her few belongings at once, on which the vulgar colonel politely offered to carry them into the car. Returning to his professional position, he drove the Humberts back to their residence, with Valeria chattering all the way, and Humbert the brute carefully discussing with Humbert the weak whether Humbert Humbert should kill her or her lover, or both, or neither. I remember holding a fellow student's automatic pistol in my hand. In those days, I don't think I've mentioned that time, but it doesn't matter, when I toyed with the idea of enjoying his little sister, a very radiant nymphette with a black ribbon in her hair, and then shooting myself. I asked myself then whether Valika, as the colonel called her, was really worth shooting, strangling, drowning. She had very sensitive feet, and I decided to limit myself, to inflict the most terrible pain on her when we were alone. But we could never do that. Valika, now shedding tears, smeared with rainbow-colored makeup, began to stuff a trunk, 2 suitcases, a bulging cardboard box, and dreamed of putting on shoes. He climbed the mountain and ran to kick her fishing rod, which of course he couldn't do with the hateful colonel constantly flitting around. I can't say he was being impudent or anything like that. On the contrary, he displayed, like a sideshow to the stage I was being lured into, an old-fashioned elegance, punctuating his movements with all sorts of inarticulate apologies. "Jai demand a pardon, excuse me, SCEK, Poos allow me," and so on, turning away delicately when Valika swung her arm to pull down the pink panties from the clothesline over the bath, but he seemed to be everywhere at once, L.E. Greedon, uniting his body with the structure of the apartment, sitting in my chair reading my newspaper, untying a string, rolling a cigarette, counting teaspoons, visiting the bathroom, helping his whore pack up the electric fan her father gave her, and carrying her luggage out into the street. I sat with my arms crossed, one hip propped up on the windowsill, numb with hatred and boredom. We finally left the trembling apartment, the shock of my door slamming behind them still vibrating in my nerves, a feeble substitute for the backhand slap I should have given her, according to the rules of the movies. Clumsily reprising my role, I stomped into the bathroom to check if they had taken my bottle of English perfume. They had not, but I recoiled with seething disgust, noticing that the former advisor to the Tsar, after emptying his bladder, had not flushed the toilet. The solemn, unfamiliar puddle of urine and the crumbling, brownish cigarette butt in it made me feel utterly humiliated, and I looked around frantically for a weapon. In truth, I dare say that it was nothing more than the Russian middle-class politeness, with a touch of Oriental flavor, perhaps, that had induced the good Colonel, Maximovic. His name suddenly rolled back to me, who was as formal as they all were, to stifle his personal needs in polite silence so as not to emphasize the small size of the landlord's apartment with the violent rush of the waterfall pouring over his own silent stream. But that did not enter my mind at the moment, and, growling in anger, I rummaged through the kitchen for something more formidable than a broom. Then, giving up searching, I rushed out of the house with the brave decision to attack him with my bare hands. Despite my natural strength, I was no fighter, while Maximovic, though short, had broad shoulders, and looked like an iron bull. The emptiness of the street, which revealed nothing of my wife's departure except a fake diamond button which she had thrown into the mud after 3 years of vain care in a broken box, might have saved me from a bloody nose. But no matter. I got some revenge in time. One day, someone from Pasadena told me that Mrs. Maximovic, née Zborovsky, had died in childbirth around 1945. The two of them had somehow made their way to California and were employed there, for a handsome fee, in a year-long experiment supervised by a prominent American ethnologist, to assess the response of humans, individually and by race, to a diet of bananas and figs, all on all fours. My informant, a doctor, swore that he had seen with his own eyes the plump Valika and her colonel, who was by then gray-haired and very fat, diligently crawling on the clean floor of the brightly lit row of cells, fruit in one room, water in another, mattresses in the third, etc., in company with several other four-legged creatures, hired and recruited from the destitute and homeless. I tried to find the results of this experiment in the Journal of Anthropology, but they do not seem to have been published. Such scientific products, of course, need some time to bear fruit. I hope they will be illustrated with many photographs when printed, although it is unlikely that the prison library will accommodate such a learned work. The library to which I am now tied, despite the support of my lawyer, is a good example of the stupid eclecticism that governs the selection of books in prison libraries. There was the Bible, of course, Dickens, an old volume, N.Y. G.W. Dillingham, Mduckelsky, the Children's Encyclopedia, with some pretty pictures of sun-haired, shorts-wearing Girl Scouts, Agatha Christie's detective story, Murder Foretold, and such glittering things as The Italian Tramp by Percy Elphinstone, author of Venice Revisited, Boston, 1868, and the comparatively recent stage celebrities, 1946, actors, producers, playwrights, and stills. As I went through the last book from cover to cover, I enjoyed last night one of those astonishing coincidences which the logician hates and the poet delights. I copied most of the page. Roland. Born 1922, Lundy, Massachusetts. Studied theater at the Elsinore Theater, Derby, New York. First performed in Sunburst. Plays performed in 2 Blocks Away, The Girl in Green, Messy Husbands, The Strange Banana, The Uncertain Situation, John Lovely, I Dream of You. Quilty, Claire, American playwright. Born 1911, Ocean City, New Jersey. Graduated from Columbia University. Started as a merchant but turned to writing plays. Author of The Little Fairy, The Woman Who Fell in Love with Lightning, with Vivian Darkbloom, The Dark Ages, The Strange Banana, The Father's Love, and many others. Many acclaimed works for children. The Little Mermaid, 1940, toured 14,000 miles in 280 performances in one winter before ending in New York. Interests, fast cars, photography, pets. Quine, Dolores. Born 1882, Dayton, Ohio. Studied drama at the American Academy. First performed in Ottawa in 1900. First performed in New York in 1904 in Never Talk to Strangers. Since then disappeared in a list of about 30 subsequent plays. How the sight of the name of one you love, even in connection with some old actress, still makes me reel with hopeless pain. Perhaps she was an actress too. Born 1935. Played, I see I misspelled a bit in the previous paragraph, but please don't correct me, Clarence, in The Murdered Playwright. Quine the Devil. Quilty is dead. Oh, my Lolita, I have nothing left but words to play with. Chapter 9. The lingering divorce delayed my voyage, and the dark shadow of another world war had already fallen over the globe when, after a winter of boredom and illness, with pneumonia, in Portugal, one finally reached the United States. In New York I eagerly took up the easy work that fate had offered me, mainly the creation and editing of perfume advertisements. I enjoyed the spontaneity and the literary flourishes of this work, and took to it when I had nothing better to do. On the other hand, a wartime university in New York urged me to finish a comparative history of French literature for English-speaking students. The first volume took me 2 years, during which time I rarely worked less than 15 hours a day. Looking back on those years, I see them divided neatly into vast expanses of light and narrow clefts of darkness. The light belonged to the solace of seeking knowledge in the palatial library, the darkness belonged to the painful lust and chronic insomnia of which I have spoken so much. Readers who now know me can easily imagine how I endured the heat and dust, trying to catch a glimpse of the nymphets, always from afar, alas, playing in Central Park, and how I was disgusted by the polished, deodorized career girls that the slut in one of the offices kept pushing on me. Let us leave these aside. A terrible depression landed me in a mental hospital for over a year. I returned to work only to be hospitalized again. A healthy outdoor life seemed to promise me some relief. One of my favorite doctors, a charming pessimist with a short brown beard, had a brother who was about to lead an expedition into the Canadian Arctic. I joined as a psychological recorder. With 2 young botanists and an old carpenter, I occasionally indulged, never really successfully, the good graces of one of our nutritionists, a certain Dr. Anita Johnson, who was soon to be flown home, I say with glee. I had little idea what the expedition was after. Judging by the large number of meteorologists in the party, we were probably tracking the lair, somewhere on Prince of Wales Island, I understand, of the wandering magnetic North Pole. One group, along with the Canadians, set up a weather station at Cape Pierre on Melville Sound. Another, also lost, was collecting plankton. The third group studied tuberculosis in the permafrost. Bird, the photographer, a chump with whom I had once happily shared the labor, he, like me, had some mental issues, insisted that the big bosses of the group, the real leaders we never saw, were primarily testing the effects of climate change on the fur of Arctic foxes. We lived in prefabricated log cabins in a world of Precambrian granite. We had plenty of supplies: Reader's Digest, ice cream mixers, chemical toilets, paper hats for Christmas. My health was surprisingly good despite, or because of, all this endless boredom and emptiness. Surrounded by boring plants like willows and lichen, soaked, and, I suppose, washed by the howling storm, sitting on a worn rock under a perfectly translucent sky, through which, however, nothing of importance peeped, I felt strangely detached from myself. No temptations drove me mad. Plump, shiny, fish-smelling Eskimo girls, with their hideous, raven-black hair and guinea-pig faces, aroused even less desire in me than Dr. Johnson. Nymphets do not appear at the poles. I left the analysis of icebergs, falling stars, swimming birds, ghosts to others, and occasionally tried to record a little of what I naively considered psychic reactions. For instance, I noticed that dreams under the midnight sun tended to be very colorful, and my photographer friend admitted it. In addition, I was supposed to interview my various companions on various important matters, such as homesickness, fear of monsters, food fantasies, wet dreams, hobbies, favorite radio programs, changes of opinion, and the like. This bored everyone so much that I threw the project away, and it was only towards the end of 20 months of cold servitude, as one of the humorous botanists put it, that I concocted a perfectly fictitious and highly graphic report which you can find in print in the Annals of Adult Psychophysics in 1945 or 1946, and also in the special issue of Arctic Exploration devoted to that particular expedition, which, after all, had nothing to do with the Victoria Island copper mines or anything of the sort, as I later learned from my good doctor, since the nature of its real purpose is what is called top secret. Let me only add that whatever it was admirably accomplished. The reader will be moved to know that, not long after my return to civilization, I had to fight again with madness, if that cruel term can be applied to the unbearable melancholy and repressed feeling of longing. I completely recovered thanks to a discovery I made while in that particularly expensive hospital. I discovered an inexhaustible source of wholesome amusement in toying with psychiatrists, leading them cleverly by the nose, never letting them see that one knew all the tricks of the trade, composing for them elaborate dreams, of purely classical style, which make them, the dream makers, dream and wake screaming, teasing them with false primordials, and never let them have the faintest idea of the patient's real sexual trouble. By bribing the nurse, I got into some of the files and found, with delight, data cards that called me potentially homosexual and completely impotent. The joke was so much fun, the results in my case so good that I stayed on for a month after I was completely well, sleeping soundly and eating like a teenager. Then I lingered another week simply for the pleasure of arguing with the new arrival, a famous, influential, and, no doubt, deranged, exile, known for his knack of making patients believe they had witnessed their own conception. Chapter 9. When I left the hospital, I looked around for some New England countryside or some sleepy little town, elm trees, white church, where I could spend the summer diligently, living off a box full of collected notes and bathing in some nearby lake. Work began to interest me again, I mean my scholarly endeavors. The other, my practical participation in my uncle's legacy, had by then dwindled to a minimum. One of my uncle's former employees, a descendant of a respectable family, suggested I spend a few months at the home of his impoverished cousin, a Mr. McCoo, retired, and his wife, who wanted to let the upper floor where their recently deceased aunt had been living. He said they had 2 little girls, one a newborn, the other 12, a beautiful garden, not far from a beautiful lake, and I exclaimed that it sounded absolutely perfect. I corresponded with these people, convinced them I was clean, and spent a wonderful night on the train, imagining every possible detail of the mysterious nymphette I would tutor in French and fondle in the Humbertian style. No one met me at the toy-like station where I got off with my expensive new handbag, no one answered the phone. Anyway, a distraught Mr. McCoo in his wet clothes finally showed up at the only hotel in the green-red town of Ramsdale, to report that his house had burned to the ground, probably from the great fire that had been raging in my veins all night long at the same time. His family, McCoo said, had taken refuge in the farmhouse.